Let's start with the Brandon Miller story. I wouldn't change anything that I've said. I stand by it all. I think it is the biggest embarrassment for the SEC, this Brandon Miller incident, for the University of Alabama, for the SEC, for college sports in general that I can remember in a very long time. I don't believe that he should be playing. He transported a murder weapon, a loaded gun, to the scene of the murder of a young mom. Her young boy, 5-year-old, I believe, will now be raised without a mother. And I don't believe that there's any way to justify the decisions that Brandon Miller's made. I sat down with my own kids, and I said, look, if you ever have somebody texting you, asking you to bring them a weapon, don't do it. If you ever have a weapon in the back of your car, don't drive it to a drunk person at 1:45 in the morning on the corner of a college campus or anywhere else in the world. It's a series of bad decisions. I think the adults in the Alabama room, president, AD, coach, I think they have all failed in their leadership. And that was further confirmed on Saturday when Brandon Miller was introduced and one of the walk-ons, I believe, pretended to check him for weapons. It's ridiculous. People say, well, they've been doing that all year. Maybe stop. Maybe don't do it after you've provided a weapon that's led to the murder of a young mom. Maybe don't continue to check to see if you have weapons when you come out onto the basketball court. Maybe don't make that your Twitter profile picture. Maybe one adult in the entire apparatus of the University of Alabama says, hey, maybe we stop the frisking. Maybe we stop the weapons check at the introduction. No one thought of this in the hundreds of employees at the University of Alabama Athletic Department. No one. I thought about it. I thought surely Alabama is not going to be dumb enough to continue to allow that to occur. And then they were dumb enough, and they've continued to allow it to occur. And I think you're basically seeing that the SEC is letting it be known that they are embarrassed by what's going on right now with the University of Alabama. And the conference itself essentially let that be known because they didn't name Brandon Miller either the SEC Player of the Week or the SEC Freshman of the Week. In fact, they picked a player on Arkansas that Alabama beat on Saturday. Brandon Miller had an average of 32.5 points per game and 7 rebounds per game. Oscar Tshiebwe was the SEC Player of the Week. Clear decision made by the conference not to reward Brandon Miller. And maybe even more noticeably, the SEC Freshman of the Week was Nick Smith Jr. at Arkansas. As I just mentioned, Arkansas lost on Saturday at Alabama. It's impossible to me to look at this and say anything other than the SEC is embarrassed by the choices that Alabama has made to keep Brandon Miller eligible. Nate Oates has done himself no favors. To be fair to Nate Oates, he did say that the weapons check, frisking, however you want to define it, celebratory introduction would end going forward. But if social media hadn't taken note of it, if sites like Outkick hadn't written about it, if I think it's tens of millions of people now hadn't watched that frisking weapons check video, I don't know that anybody at Alabama would have thought, oh, this is something we should be embarrassed by. And again, I think Alabama fans have tremendously embarrassed themselves in the way that they've responded to this. And I said this last week. Look, if Brandon Miller played for Auburn and every other situation were the same, right? If somewhere off Auburn's campus, Brandon Miller had transported a gun to the venue and of the murder, to the murder scene, and Auburn had continued to play him, and Auburn were attempting to be a number 1 overall seed, Alabama fans would be in an uproar. The only reason Alabama fans are defending this, and by the way, overwhelmingly every other fan base in the country is embarrassed by what Alabama's doing, is because Brandon Miller's a really good player. And like I said last week, if this dude may average 3 points a game and played 8 minutes or 12 minutes a game, he would have gotten suspended or kicked off the team. I don't think there's any doubt. So Alabama has made the calculated decision that Brandon Miller is so good at basketball that it doesn't matter that he transported a murder weapon. And people are like, well, Jay Billis said he has rights. Okay, he does have rights. Every individual in America has rights. I did criminal defense law. Playing sports is a privilege. It's not a right. People get suspended or kicked off sports teams all the time for relatively inconsequential matters. Some of you probably have been on a team that got a guy kicked off, showing up late for practice, violating a team rule, not listening to the coach, making poor grades. These are relatively small matters of misbehavior that regularly get players suspended or kicked off teams. Being involved in taking a loaded murder weapon to the scene of a murder is worthy of being kicked off the team in my mind. And the fact that head coach Nate Oates, athletic director Greg Byrne, I think his name is Stuart Stevens, the president of the University of Alabama, the fact that the adults in leadership positions at the University of Alabama have made this decision is a huge embarrassment for Alabama and a huge failure of their leadership, in my opinion, and an embarrassment to the SEC, as I think the SEC is letting you know by not awarding Brandon Miller, who's a very talented basketball player, any sort of commendation for his play on the court this week since this information has come out. And to me, this is the worst story for the SEC. It was even covered in the Guardian newspaper in England. They were like, how in the world is Brandon Miller still playing in the Guardian newspaper in England? And if you go into the comments underneath any University of Alabama account, when they're sharing any information, I saw Justin Thomas retweet that he had been at the game, and he just retweeted a picture of himself, the PGA golfer, and the comments underneath it were unbelievably negative towards Alabama. This is not some biased situation where you're being treated unfairly at Alabama. Everyone except for Alabama fans who is a sports fan looks at this and says, my goodness, this is an embarrassment. People say, well, where's the line? I don't know, right? Could agree to disagree on a lot of things. Remember how much of a scandal in quotation marks, it was about Cam Newton playing at Auburn? Alabama fans lost their minds over Cam Newton being eligible to play at Auburn based on a dispute of whether Cam Newton was paid to go to Auburn or not. And that was a huge story. I remember, I covered it. I said I thought the likelihood was that Cam had been paid and that as a result he violated rules and he shouldn't be playing. Alabama fans agreed with me then. But comparing Cam Newton potentially getting paid to this Brandon Miller situation is crazy. Alabama fans were demanding that Cam Newton not play, and now they're saying, oh, we're being treated unfairly because people are saying, yeah, I think Brandon Miller shouldn't be playing given what's going on in this case, given the fact that a mom lost her life and that a 5-year-old now is going to grow up without his mom because of the choices made by Brandon Miller. He chose to drive a car to the murder scene with a gun in the back. People are like, he didn't know the gun was there. Well, he got a text message letting him know that the person there needed his gun. All right. Well, they're like, well, he didn't even get that text message. Okay. But if you actually look even at the statement of the defense attorney, I don't begrudge a defense attorney. I've been a defense attorney. Your job when you're a defense attorney is to put your client's behavior in the best possible light. That is the job. I understand it. I've done it. I've defended people accused of murder. I've defended people accused of domestic assault. I've defended people who've been accused of dealing drugs. Like, I've defended people who have been involved in the criminal justice system before. I know what the job is. I respect the job. I don't begrudge any attorney. You are an advocate for your client. But if you look at what he says in his statement defending Brandon Miller, he says, Brandon never touched the gun, was not involved in the exchange to Mr. Davis in any way, and never knew that illegal activity involving the gun would occur. Do you see what he's not saying there? He's specifically not saying that Brandon Miller was unaware there was a gun in the car. Again, Brandon never touched the gun, was not involved in the exchange to Mr. Davis in any way. Davis is the man who fired the shots. And never knew that illegal activity involving the gun would occur. But he drove to a place with a gun that he knew was in the back of his car after receiving a text message from an individual who said, I need my joint, a blank just got a fakin'. Again, I'm not an expert in lingo here, right? But faking means threatened, according to the testimony from the detective in this case. So Miles's defense attorney says that Miles texted Miller at 1:38 a.m., I need my joint. And let's just remember this. He didn't say, hey, I left my gun in the back of your car. It's underneath some clothes. I didn't tell you. He said, I need my gun, which would indicate that he knew the gun was there. Miller did already. And then you combine that with the statement from Miller himself, his own attorney, Brandon never touched the gun, was not involved in the exchange to Mr. Davis in any way, and never knew illegal activity involving the gun would occur. He doesn't say he didn't know the gun was in the car. The text message came saying the guy needed his gun. It's 1:38 in the morning. If Brandon Miller had just said, I'm going to bed, drank too much, can't get out, I'll send you an Uber, just get in the Uber and come home, stay out of trouble, then there would still be a mom alive today. And Brandon Miller, in my opinion, has given up his ability to have the privilege of representing the University of Alabama. That's the story. I'm not changing. I wouldn't change a single word that I've said from the get-go on this case. I think the University of Alabama has embarrassed itself. Certainly, it appears the SEC agrees, the parent conference, and it also is certainly the case that the vast majority of American sports fans all over the country agree as well.